Previously on Bob of the Old Ways. Rings of Power gives Galadriel a common and quickly understood motivation that most people can easily see turning into an obsession. The show does want us to sympathize with her, and your mileage may vary on that, fair enough. But sympathizing with someone and liking them are different things. You are supposed to be frustrated by this version of Galadriel when you meet her. If you think the Rings of Power's goal was to present Galadriel as an inspirational, stunning and brave girl boss, then you have not understood what this show is doing. At all. When I first heard that Amazon Prime was going to make its own Lord of the Rings TV show, I had pretty much the same reaction as everybody else in the world.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
Please don't!
Well, maybe not everybody else.
Next subject. This is one near and dear to my heart. I am very happy about this, and I'd like to make some very early predictions. So Lord of the Rings, we've talked about last podcast, is going into production at Amazon, and they have agreed to multiple seasons, which is good. They're going to do a true adaptation. I was talking about this with John, too. Just wait. Harry Potter's next. I don't know if it'll be at Amazon, but Harry Potter's next. I'll be very excited to see that, too, where you get a true adaptation, and you get multiple seasons. Because Lord of the Rings is deep. It is so deep. I know Dennis isn't a fan of the movies. They're probably my favorite trilogy. They are my favorite movies. I watch them again and again. I love the hell out of them, and they skim the surface of that book. So, yeah, I'm super excited that Amazon's going to put the money behind this.
But then a funny thing happened. The aspiring God Emperor Bezos actually went through with it, and I watched it, and I liked it. A lot. A whole lot. A whole lot more than I ever expected to. And a big part of why I liked it was both of these ladies right here.
There's a tempest in me. It swept me to this island for a reason, and it will not be quelled by you, Regent.
These two ladies are, of course, Galadriel, the character, and Morfydd Clark, the actress who portrays her. Clark's performance as Galadriel really intrigued me because for the first time anywhere on screen, I was being given a glimpse of the Galadriel from Tolkien's deep lore, the Galadriel he built in fits and starts over the course of his entire life, the Galadriel whose contradictory backstory only began to emerge from the professor's mind after she'd already appeared in his novel, The Lord of the Rings. The Galadriel we didn't get to see in either that novel or Peter Jackson's movie adaptations. After only a few minutes of watching the first episode of Rings of Power, I had figured out which elements of Galadriel's lore had been used to construct the version of her that we see in the show. I also watched this version of Galadriel become grist for the culture war mill among outrage-farming dorks on YouTube, many of whom had clearly never read a word of Tolkien's writing.
The idea of a warrior Galadriel actually comes from the original author's mind. That's where the gaslighting happens, because no, warrior Galadriel does not. And this is why, when you have mainstream covering nerd-type topics, this is why you need some nerds on your team, dude. You need some gamers, you need some nerds, you need somebody, because anybody will tell you, you're going to swap the entire class of the character. That's a giant no-no, because the character classes, when it comes to fantasy or anything like that, play a huge role. It plays a big role in the character and their personality, and all that kind of stuff. And the way I kind of parallel this is changing Galadriel from a mage class to a warrior class, and trying to pass that off as, oh, it's okay, but she was hot-headed. Yeah, okay, well, you can make her hot-headed and still keep her a mage. Why couldn't you do that?
So for this third and final official entry in my long overdue defense of the Rings of Power, I'm going to explore the weird Tolkien quotes that were obviously used to build Rings of Power's version of the character. Thematically, the show gets a lot right about Galadriel, assuming that one considers Tolkien's supplemental writings, the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the histories, letters, etc., to be canon in the first place, which I personally don't. But I know I'm in the minority on that one. Still, if you want to know more about why I don't, I recommend this excellent video by Jess of the Shire. My perspective on the matter is basically the same as hers. Anyway, my point with the video you're watching right now is not to prove that Rings of Power has crafted a one-for-one perfect adaptation of Tolkien's Galadriel from those supplemental writings. One-for-one perfect adaptations from book to screen are never actually possible, and if this is your expectation, you will be forever disappointed. I think it's more realistic and more fair to measure an adaptation by whether it stays true to the original work's themes and aesthetics, or by whether the characters it constructs from elements in the source material feel like those original characters in a new situation, rather than feeling like entirely new beings. And on that latter standard, Rings of Power gets a lot right about Galadriel. One of the ironies of the culture war discourse around Rings of Power is that the outrage it astroturfed around Galadriel uses public memory of Peter Jackson's films to filter out Tolkien's vision of the character from sources like Unfinished Tales. Jackson did not have the film rights to Tolkien's supplemental works, so he, understandably, ignored them. The version of Galadriel we're served in his movies is pretty faithful to her depiction in the Lord of the Rings novels, but it's also completely uninfluenced by anything else Tolkien wrote about her. Rings of Power doesn't have this issue. While Amazon Prime and showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay don't have the adaptation rights to Tolkien's full legendarium either, they do have an agreement directly with the Tolkien estate itself, something Jackson never had, and still doesn't have, and likely will never have. And under that agreement, they can get approval from the estate to adapt bits of lore from the wider legendarium on a case-by-case basis, and thus they have more creative wiggle room when designing their version of Galadriel than Peter Jackson ever had. Unlike Jackson, Payne and McKay can actually use other things that Tolkien wrote about Galadriel. So what follows is a look at the bits of Tolkien lore about Galadriel that I think the Amazon team used to construct the Rings of Power version of the character. These are bits of lore that have always been there in the legendarium, but have never been tapped as a source for any kind of visual adaptation. Bits that got filtered out of the default pop cultural memory of Galadriel by the overwhelming popularity of Jackson's movies. Bits that are now, in some quarters of the internet, being actively obscured by right-wing culture war dorks who consider Middle-earth to be their exclusive property to shape according to their vision. So let's start with what I think is the main hook on which the Rings of Power team hangs every other part of their version of Galadriel. The seed from which they cultivated the self-willed, hot-headed, unknowingly corrupted warrior woman that way too many internet trolls have dubbed Guy-Ladriel. It's found in the 11th chapter of The Peoples of Middle-earth, the final book of Christopher Tolkien's 12-volume series analyzing the unpublished manuscripts of his father, J.R.R. Tolkien. The chapter is titled The Shibboleth of Feanor, and it deals mainly with the way that political and historical factors caused a phonological shift in the pronunciation of a single letter of the Elven language alphabet. Tolkien was a gigantic language nerd. Anyway, in the middle of that discussion is an interesting passage about Galadriel that contains some evocative words about her inner life, a passage that immediately sprang to my mind when I saw what Rings of Power was doing with her. Galadriel was born in the bliss of Valinor, but it was not long in the reckoning of the Blessed Realm before that was dimmed, and thereafter she had no peace within. From her earliest years she had a marvelous gift of insight into the minds of others, but judged them with mercy and understanding, and she withheld her goodwill from none save only Feanor. In him she perceived a darkness that she hated and feared, though she did not perceive that the shadow of the same evil had fallen upon the minds of all the Noldor, and upon her own. She was born in bliss, but soon that bliss dimmed, and after it she had no peace within. She failed to see that the evil that had infected her enemy's mind had also infected her own. Now, where have we heard that sentiment before?
It would seem I'm not the only elf alive who's being transformed by darkness. Perhaps your search for Morgoth's successor should have ended in your own mirror.
I've seen a lot of people over the past 2 years since Rings of Power debuted objecting that adapting Galadriel's second-age personality in this way breaks Tolkien's lore, because he wrote her as always having been blessed with insight and judging people with mercy. When they do that, such people are usually referring to the passage I just quoted and leaving out the bits about her never having peace within and failing to perceive that the shadow had fallen upon her own mind. This objection seems to want a powerful and pristine Galadriel who never changes, never grows, never fails, never struggles, never learns. Often, the people who make this objection will also complain a lot about Mary Sues in popular fiction. Have fun trying to square that circle, because I sure can't. Now, like I said earlier, a lot of this objection filters Galadriel through the Lord of the Rings movies and novels, while ignoring everything else Tolkien wrote about her. Right-wing culture war dorks who make hay with the Galadriel meme especially rely on the fact that more people have seen Jackson's movies than have read Tolkien's full legendarium, and so they're able to sell the idea that the sorrowful but ethereal vision of her we meet in those movies is Galadriel's default state, the one she existed in since the First Age. But it just ain't so, folks. Here's what Tolkien himself wrote about Galadriel's character development over those thousands of years. This passage is from The History of Galadriel and Celeborn in Unfinished Tales. Pride still moved her when, at the end of the Elder Days after the final overthrow of Morgoth, she refused the pardon of the Valar for all who had fought against him and remained in Middle-earth. It was not until 2 long ages more had passed, when at last all she had desired in her youth came to her hand, the ring of power and the dominion of Middle-earth of which she had dreamed, that her wisdom was full-grown and she rejected it, and passing the last test, departed from Middle-earth forever. Pride still moved her at the end of the First Age. It took her 2 long ages more to grow into the grace and wisdom she displays in The Lord of the Rings. In other words, it took Galadriel thousands of years, all of the Second Age and most of the Third, to become the wise angelic icon we're used to seeing. Elves age and develop more slowly than humans. During the Second Age, when Rings of Power takes place, Galadriel is still growing up, as it were, still developing the skills of insight and the qualities of mercy that always competed with the pride and arrogance that also drove her. If Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings can be seen as her in her eldest, wisest years at the end of her time in Middle-earth, then Second Age Galadriel can be seen as her in her tempestuous, vengeful, hot-blooded early adulthood. And this younger, commandeering version of Galadriel was a warrior, the way Tolkien wrote her. It's kind of ironic that so many reactionary opponents of Rings of Power derisively refer to its depiction of Galadriel as Guy-Ladriel, because Tolkien kind of did the same thing, only he meant it as a compliment. The professor tells us, again in the Shibboleth of Feanor, that Galadriel's mother name was Nerwin, Man-Maiden, and she grew to be tall beyond the measure even of the women of the Noldor. She was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the lore masters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. In Letter 348, Tolkien says that Galadriel was then of Amazon disposition, and bound up her hair as a crown while taking part in athletic feats. Worth noting here is that the lore masters mentioned above were not simply scholars, as some skeptics of the warrior Galadriel have insinuated. Quite the contrary. As Tolkien writes in Note 23 of the Shibboleth, nor were the lore masters a separate guild of gentle scribes, soon burned by the orcs of Angband upon pyres of books. They were mostly even as Feanor, the greatest, kings, princes, and warriors, such as the valiant captains of Gondolin, or Finrod of Nargothrond, and Rodothir his kinsman and steward. In other words, Tolkien himself tells us, in a roundabout way, that Galadriel could kick some serious ass. She was, in the lore, as he wrote it, a trained and superior warrior. That's what being a match for the lore masters, that is to say, for the greatest warriors of the Eldar in the days of their youth, means. Indeed, every time Tolkien describes Galadriel's early years, he goes out of his way to say she was both mentally and physically strong, she was brave, she was valiant, and so on. And there are a few instances in his essays where Galadriel's explicitly described as having taken part in battles, particularly during the Elven rebellion against the Valar, of which she was one of the leaders, and at Feanor's burning of the Teleri ships at Aqualande, where the shibboleth says she fought fiercely in defense of her mother's kin, and where a marginal note in another essay, Morgoth's Ring, says that both Galadriel and her brother Finrod fought against Feanor. In Unfinished Tales, we're told that she looked upon the dwarves also with the eyes of a commander, seeing in them the finest warriors to pit against the orcs. Other threads of Tolkien's writing can be marshaled to defend a warrior maiden vision of Galadriel as well. Tolkien notes in Morgoth's Ring, an essay in the Silmarillion, that in dire straits or desperate defense, elf women fought valiantly. Galadriel was present at the Battle of the Lamoth after crossing the Helcaraxa with the rest of Fingolfin's followers. It's reasonable to assume that she and other elven women would have fought there in desperate defense, as those were pretty dire straits. It's also a fair assumption that she fought in the War of Wrath during the First Age, as the history of Middle-earth tells us that Eonwe summoned all free people to fight and only cowards rejected his summons, and Galadriel was no coward. A similar assumption could apply to events like the ruin of Doriath and the Third Kinslaying, both of which Galadriel would have been present for. Given all this context and background, it's worth looking at Galadriel's presence in Eregion during the Second Age War between Sauron and the Elves. We know from notes in The Nature of Middle-earth that she was present for Sauron's sacking and siege of Eregion, an event that is going to stretch across 2 episodes in Season 2 of The Rings of Power, along with her husband Celeborn. According to one version of her backstory, she, Celeborn, and other elves retreated from Eregion after its fall, and took refuge for a time in Moria, home of the dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm, before moving on to Lindon. In another, separate version of Galadriel's backstory, she retreats from Eregion to Lindon and allies with King Gelgalad, while Celeborn takes other elven refugees to Lorien. In both versions, it's clear Galadriel was present for the actual Battle of Eregion, and continued to take part in the Greater Elven War with Sauron. And given her established status as a warrior equal to the greatest of the Eldar in their youth, it would be kind of silly to assume that she did not take part in both the planning and the fighting of battles throughout that war, which it looks like she is going to be doing a lot in Rings of Power Season 2. Now, when examining all of this lore, you will often hear people object that none of it explicitly says that Galadriel ever picked up a weapon, and that's true. But none of it explicitly says that Celeborn did either. People just assume that Celeborn did all the manly fighting stuff, and Galadriel did all the womanly magic stuff because they're reading their particular ideas about inherent gender qualities backwards into the text, often through the lens of Peter Jackson's cinematic portrayal of Galadriel. But nothing in the text itself either supports that conclusion or precludes a more martial vision of Galadriel. So let's step back and take stock of the Tolkien lore data points here. Pulling together all these threads from the multiple different backstories Tolkien wrote for Galadriel, we can easily justify a vision of the character quite similar to the one in the Rings of Power. Tolkien tells us that Galadriel never knew peace within herself, and didn't notice herself falling under the influence of evil, just like we see her in the Rings of Power. Tolkien tells us that Galadriel was a physically and mentally strong, courageous warrior with a keen strategic mind, just like we see her in the Rings of Power. Tolkien tells us that Galadriel was, at times, motivated by pride and revenge and had an ambition to be in charge, just like we see her in the Rings of Power. The one aspect of Galadriel we haven't yet seen in the Rings of Power is the one emphasized in Tolkien's actual novel, The Lord of the Rings, and in Peter Jackson's movies. But if you paid any attention at all to her character development in Rings of Power Season 1, you'd see that that aspect is on its way. The showrunners here have a 5-season commitment. That's a lot of character development, and this version of Galadriel is at the beginning of her narrative journey, not the end of it. I guarantee you that by the end of Season 5, she will look a lot more like the Galadriel you expected because of Peter Jackson's movies than she does right now. Everything we've seen so far of Rings of Power Galadriel is perfectly consistent with the lore Tolkien wrote for her. and I for one don't expect that to change. All of these people telling you otherwise are lying to you. But let me know what you think in the comments, because engagement feeds the great god algorithm, and he is a hungry god indeed. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women. Shanti, salam, shalom.